Everybody, thank you for joining us. This is our second edition of Weaveworks Office Hours. This is a weekly program that is going to include kind of a rotating cast of guests. Today, we have our talented solutions engineer, Daryl Weaver, that's joining us and is going to be showing off some of our cool technology and answering some questions for us. This happens every week on Wednesdays at 10 to 10:30 a.m. Pacific, and the subject and the topics that we're going to cover will change from week to week. We hope that you find something of value in each one of these that we do. To answer a couple of frequently asked questions, we record these and we do make them available. So everybody that attends is going to be able to get a link sometime tomorrow to the recorded version of this office hours session, and you'll be able to go back and look at previous episodes as well. We love to hear your questions and answer them. There's a couple ways that you can do that. You can use the chat, that'll chat those questions to everybody, but you can also use the Q&A panel. That's what we recommend. To find that, look at the bottom of your screen, the Zoom interface, and there's a Q&A icon. Click that. Ask a question, it'll put it into stack ranked order of questions that we'll answer after we get through the material today. Nothing's off topic, right? Anything Flux related, anything GitOps related, anything cloud native related. The only thing that we can't do on a session like this is, review your architecture and make recommendations, because that would just be a little difficult, but otherwise, we'd love to hear your questions and get you some good technical answers. Today, we're going to be talking about the new product, Weave GitOps Assured. Daryl's going to take us through a little bit of the Weave GitOps user interface and let you see what it looks like when you put a beautiful face to the front end of Flux and all of the great observability, monitoring, notifications, alerts, and views that you can get when using that. So if you're familiar with Flux, but not with the Weave GitOps UI, this is going to be a treat. With that, I'm going to kick it over to you, Daryl, and let you kind of do a quick intro on, from your perspective, what Weave GitOps Assured is, and then you can take a look at that UI and step people through it. Oh, you're muted.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Right, you should be able to hear me now. Okay, so what is Weave GitOps Assured? I'm going to go through an architecture diagram, but basically Weave GitOps Assured is a collection of our open source components, which include Flux, Flagger, Weave Policy Agent, Weave GitOps user interface, and all these and TF controller as well. And all these components run in a Kubernetes cluster, which then enables you for GitOps, progressive delivery, policy controls, and in fact to reach outside of the Kubernetes cluster and manage resources that are managed through Terraform, for example, with TF controller. And that allows you to manage things like virtual machines and IAM roles or RDS databases or other such cloud resources that you need for your application stack that may live outside of Kubernetes. So let me share my screen and we can have a look at the architecture diagram. Okay. Sorry, desktop. Okay, you should be able to see my screen now. Okay, so what do we have here? Well, on the right-hand side here, we have a Kubernetes cluster. If we zoom in a little bit here, we can see some of the details. It's obviously running on a number of different infrastructure providers. So that could be AWS with EKS clusters, could be Azure AKS clusters, could be GKE clusters, Rancher, or something on VMware on-premise, or just a bare upstream Kubernetes cluster. On the Kubernetes cluster, we then install Flux. Now, Flux has several components. We've got the source controller. The source controller is in charge of sourcing information from Git repositories, which we've got represented over here. And then we've got the Helm controller, which installs Helm charts, and the Customize controller, which installs customized manifests or bare Kubernetes manifests. In addition, we have the notification controller, and the notification controller takes charge of sending out notifications to various different endpoint sources, such as your chat bot, like Slack or Teams, or it might output to a Git repository to give you some feedback on particular Git commits and whether they've deployed correctly or not. Once Flux is in place, Flux can then take charge in deploying all of the components on top of your Kubernetes cluster to build your platform. So that would be your platform apps. So things like Dex or Cert Manager, Prometheus, Elk Stack, Ingress Nginx, HashiCorp Vault, all these components that you build into a platform. Flux can deploy all of those for you. And in addition, can also set up the namespaces for tenants and the tenant RBAC to isolate those tenants to their namespaces. In addition, we also have a couple of other components that we optionally add, including the Weave policy agent, which implements policy controls, which is open source, so you can install that. And that gives you controls over what people can change in a Kubernetes manifest. So for example, you might have a policy that enforces replica count so that you don't have anybody deploying a single replica service. They've always got to be more than one so that there's some redundancy built in. We also have the Weave GitOps UI, which I'm going to demonstrate shortly, which shows you the status of all of your GitOps objects in the cluster and whether they're synced, what their latest update was, and what version they are. We also have the TF controller, which, as I said earlier, helps you manage resources outside of the Kubernetes cluster. So you can use Terraform HCL language to write your modules so that you can control services that are outside of the Kubernetes cluster. This is typically used alongside Kubernetes applications for things like IAM roles, so that you've got the right permissions for running certain services. Or perhaps backend databases for applications that run in Kubernetes stateless, but then reach out to the cloud provider to store stateful information in a database like an RDS database like MySQL or Postgres. Let's move that over there. And then we've got, of course, a collection of Git repositories, which would be stored in your Git repository manager source, which would typically be GitHub or GitLab. There are others, and we would recommend splitting those up depending on the teams that you have available for different responsibilities of the platform and applications. So here we're showing basically a fleet repository, which defines all the Kubernetes clusters that you manage. And this is typically managed by the platform engineers in the platform team. But they also have a platform repository, which contains all the platform components, the platform apps here that we're deploying to all clusters to create our Kubernetes platform for application developers to consume. Then we've got the application team repositories, which are typically managed by each individual team. So they tend to have their own repository for each team. And they will be in charge of a particular application, a particular namespace or group of namespaces. And we've represented the application developers up here as separate teams. And we can show that, in fact, when you're logging into the Weave GitOps UI, you also use OIDC authentication, which can help you with the different tenant views that you need for the different application teams and the platform engineering team. The platform engineering team would typically have access to all of the cluster components, would be able to see all the platform apps, perhaps even the cluster definitions and the tenant configuration. And then the tenants would be responsible for deploying their applications within each tenant workspace. And so we're showing 4 different tenants here, where they're using Helm to deploy their applications, or they're using Customize to deploy their applications. So that's the architecture diagram. And so now if I move on to demoing the user interface.
While you're doing that, just to kind of reiterate for folks that are watching as Daryl logs in here. So if you're familiar with Flux and you're familiar with the controllers that are available to use with Flux, you should know that we have some open source tools to extend that. So the UI, the observability UI that Daryl's just about to demo, is an open source tool available from Weaveworks. That TF controller that you were talking about, also a part of the Weave GitOps open source solution, and the Weave policy agent as well. So you get policy as code, infrastructure management tools, and a great UI, all open source that are built on top of Flux and extend its capabilities. It's great.
Okay, so let's log in. So we've got a small Kubernetes cluster here running a couple of applications, and now I'm logging into the user interface. If you're familiar with Flux, then you'll be familiar with the Flux CLI command, which you run at the command line and gives you output similar to this that would show you the status of your Flux objects. But the UI gives you a richer view. So here we can see 3 applications that we've got installed. We can see the one's actually not installed correctly. So we can see the not ready status icon here. And we typically order by status so that we can see what's not ready or what's currently deploying pops to the top of the list, and everything that's green and ready drops to the bottom. We can inspect the individual applications. We've got the Flux system application here, which is basically Flux itself, and is the top level class customization that we point to a cluster directory, and then everything underneath that would then get deployed automatically. So we can inspect that. If I click on it, we can see some details about the application. We can see because this is a customization, we can see the commit SHA that was the latest sync from the Git repository. And we can see another green tick here saying that all of our workloads are passing their health checks. So everything's green and good. On the top corner here, we have the last updated time, so 7 minutes ago. And so we can just glance at that to see how recent our updates are. Typically, when you're doing changes, of course, you want to be looking at the commit SHA and the last updated time to understand whether or not your change has reached the cluster yet. In the detail, let's look at the more information. So we've got more information here. We can see that it's a customization. We can see the namespace, any labels that are attached to that customization, and the source Git repository that we're pulling this customization from, and the path in that Git repository. So we can trace that back to the Git repository, into the path, and see all of the details of everything that's being deployed there. We can also see the details of what's created in the Kubernetes cluster listed down under the details. So we can see all our custom resource definitions, network policies, Helm repositories, Git repositories, and so on that have been installed as part of this customization. So this can get quite long and busy with all of the objects that are potentially deployed to your cluster. It depends whether or not you've broken it up into one deployment where you've got a sort of Flux system deployment, which has then got Kubernetes manifests of all different types underneath, or whether or not you're using a customization underneath that, or Helm releases underneath that are then pulling additional sources of information as well. So other paths in the same repository or completely separate repositories, which is typically how we would expect tenants to be managed. So you have a separate repository for each tenant and each tenant application deployment. If we want to inspect any of the details here, we can see, for example, this Helm repository. I can click on that, and that will take me actually to the source information for this Helm repository, where I can see the URL of that Helm repository and the labels and the last updated time and interval when we're doing a refresh of the data. So we're basically going to update the data every 10 minutes. And so once there's been a change to the repository, in this case a Helm repository, so if MySQL release a new version of the chart, this will be updated by Flux every 10 minutes. We can also see events. So if we click on the events, we can see all of the Kubernetes event messages that come from the message bus from the Kubernetes cluster for this particular object. So we can see, if we scroll down, we can see the history of what's been done. And we can see that 30 minutes ago we had the first reconciliation finished. And then we had a whole bunch of other stuff that was being deployed. And then we can see, again, reconciliation finished. And then we've got an additional install of some additional components. So you can see the history of what you've deployed using this customization through inspecting the events. We also have a graph. This gives you a view of all the objects that are deployed as part of this customization in a sort of tree diagram, so that you can zoom in and out. You can inspect the objects. You can see at a glance anything that's not deployed correctly with a red mark, or if it's got a green tick, you know that that's deployed correctly. We can also declare dependencies in Flux. So we can see those dependencies here. Unfortunately, I haven't got any dependencies declared for this particular customization. So we don't see any dependencies on this particular object. You can also inspect the YAML, which you get a command here that you can copy if you want to, and use that at the command line to get the same information from the Kubernetes cluster directly. Otherwise, you can see here the details of the customization as it exists in the cluster, including the managed fields for server-side apply. So at a glance, you can see which parts of the spec of this object is actually managed by Flux. So we can see here the customized toolkit, Flux CD. We can see which fields that are managed directly by the Flux object. And what we'll find is that there will also be a controller update for the status fields as well. So once we deploy that object, the customized controller updates the status according to whether the object deploys correctly or not. We've got the spec down here, which would be included in your Git repository of your Flux objects. So you would see that in your Git repository. And then we've got the actual status section down the bottom here, where we can see the last applied revision. And we've even got an inventory of the objects that are deployed, which we can see there as well. So that's the basics of the power of the UI, is being able to basically inspect all your applications, their status, and how they're looking. We can also inspect the actual deployment of Weave GitOps here. This is actually the UI I am using at the moment, the Weave GitOps dashboard. And we can see that it was a Helm release, and it's version 4033 is the version I'm using. And we can see all the components that are deployed as part of the dashboard deployment as well, including service accounts, services, cluster roles and bindings, etc. We've also separately shown a list of sources. Now, the list of sources, again, we've got a status field for the source, so we can have a look at the list of sources, and we can order by status so we can see what's not working properly right at the top of the list. And here we can see that we've got a failure to pull a Helm repository source. It's basically saying it's not found, probably got a mistake in the URL of where that source is supposed to come from. So it's been unable to validate that source, and you can see the URL is empty here as well. We've got a collection of other sources, mostly Git repositories and Helm repositories. But we are now able to also source from OCI repositories and S3 buckets, in addition to Git and Helm. We can see a list of the different Helm charts, or Helm repositories, I should say, which contain Helm charts that we've got access to, because we've enabled all of these repositories for this cluster. And so we can use those as sources for deploying additional applications. There's some other sections here as well. We have image automation, which I don't actually have set up for this demo, so I'm not going to be able to show you anything here. But basically, this is for automating Docker updates, as in Docker image updates, so that if you release a new version of an image for an application, if you're developing the application and controlling the release process, then you can use image automation to basically update the application in environments by automatically deploying the latest version. And that's done by making an automated pull request to the Fleet repository to update the version of the app. We also have Weave Policy Agent, which I didn't quite have time to prepare for this. So again, I haven't got any policies installed here, but we have got the Weave Policy Agent that runs in the cluster as an admission controller. And then you can use a few policies to restrict what people can do. So typical example is replica count. So you have replica counts in your deployments, and if you've got a replica count of 1, then you've only got 1 pod running for that service. Well, that's not very high availability. So what we want to do is we add a policy that enforces replica count to 2 or more. So moving on to the Flux runtime. So here we can see the version of Flux that you have installed and the image that it's using here. And we're using Flux at version 2, the 201, the fully GA version of Flux. And that includes customized controller at version 101, notification controller at version 100, and source controller at 101. Helm controller is still at version 0350. We haven't progressed that to version 1 just yet. So we can see all those components are installed, and we've got the green tick showing that they're ready as well. But we can also view the custom resource definitions that we have installed and the version of those. Now, everybody knows that Kubernetes is very tied to the version of the API resources. And of course, it's difficult to downgrade API resources in a Kubernetes cluster. So it's generally quite important that you understand which versions of which APIs you have in each of your target clusters. So here we can see that, and we can see the versions of all the different CRDs that we installed as part of Flux. And we can see what versions they are. We're still on V1 Beta 2 for some of our components, including the alerts, a bucket source, the Helm chart and Helm repository, the OCI repository and the provider CRDs. But we've now incremented to version 1, which now means that the API is stable and won't be broken. And that's on the receivers, the customizations, and the Git repository objects. So we can see all of that for our cluster. And therefore, when we're creating, for example, a Helm release object, we know that we have to set the API version to V2 Beta 1. The last section I'm going to show you here is the notifications. Now, this is basically part of the providers setup. The providers allow me to connect the notification controller to an endpoint. In this case, I'm using a Slack channel, and I can also see if there's any alerts on that, which we don't actually have any alerts at the moment. But I can also inspect the actual provider YAML, which is how we set the spec for the provider. So we've got the spec sets here. Okay, so that's basically the main UI for Weave GitOps. And that's at version 0350 at the moment. Is that the latest version? I'm not even sure that that is the latest version. I think we might have released some more versions, but I've only deployed the 035. Okay, I'm going to pause there and ask for questions.
Thank you so much, Daryl. That was a great demo, and really powerful extensions and additional capabilities that you get on top of Flux. And again, for everybody that's listening in and watching out there and wondering, these are all open source tools. They're available from Weaveworks as a bundle. You can go to weave.works, our website, and check out the open source projects tab and find Weave GitOps easily and get taken to the repo where you can download it and view the README, things like that. It should be noted that when we're talking about Weave GitOps Assured, it goes a little further than just these open source components in the toolkit. Assured provides some important things that I think everybody should know about. Number one, you get enterprise grade support from the people that built and are heavily involved in the maintaining of Flux, have built Weave GitOps, all of the tools that Daryl demoed today. So if you're at an organization that needs that kind of production ready confidence of having support and a support package with SLA guarantees, and it's choppy waters out there when you're dealing with open source without that kind of support in many cases. So if that's something that's interesting to you, please reach out to us at weave.works and we can provide you with some more information. But you also get bitstream assurance. So we will continuously build new secure packages that address CVEs and stay on top of that. In most cases, days and weeks faster than you're going to get updates from CNCF and the Flux project for any CVEs or security issues that have been detected in that code. You also get access to a library of integrations, a catalog that helps you save some time and use some really robust pressure-tested integrations and extensions that we've built at Weaveworks that have some guarantees around their the quality and the accessibility of those tools as well. Am I missing anything, Daryl? Are there some other cool things that we get from Assured, or is that largely it?
Yeah, so I mean, there's some other open source projects as well. One is called Flamingo, which is it's basically a kind of skin on Argo CD, one of our competitor products. But if you are in the world of platform engineering, generally it's the developers that choose the tool. So what we've found is that the platform engineering teams would generally prefer Flux, as it tends to be more powerful, especially for the platform engineering case, which is a lot of components that are interrelated. And so we find platform teams want to use Flux, but then when they try and hand over to application teams frequently choose Argo for the UI and for ease of use. The platform team doesn't get the choice, and so they have to support both Argo and Flux. So we've created Flamingo, which is a skin or a modification, shall we say, to the Argo CD UI, but allows it to also view Flux objects. So that gives you the power of being able to manage your Argo objects alongside your Flux objects in the same UI. And that is quite a powerful tool for platform engineering teams to provide the experience that application developers want, whether or not they choose Argo or whether they choose Flux. So that is included in Assured, and therefore we provide support on that for your mixed deployments of applications.
That sounds great. So platform teams, application teams, you can have your cake and eat it too. by using Flamingo to get that, nice front end Argo experience, but then have the power and the extensibility of the Flux controllers that platform teams and certainly security teams seem to prefer. So that's a great solution and also a part of Assured. If you've got questions, folks in the audience, we're going to go for about 2 more minutes and then we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. So if you've got a question, feel free to put it into the Q&A session. If not, we're going to go ahead and wrap things up in about 2 minutes. I wanted to say thanks again for attending. I hope that you found something useful and educational in the material that Daryl showed today. If you've got questions about Weave GitOps Assured, there's a bunch of ways that you can ask. You can ask now. You can send an email to sales@weave.works. You can go to our website and use the contact form there. Our website is weave.works. You can also go to our community Slack. It's vibrant community full of people that are doing awesome things with Flux, with GitOps, with cloud native applications. And you can find all of that information at weave.works as well. With that, I want to say thank you very much for attending. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day today and look forward to chatting with you all next week. Thanks so much, Daryl.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good one.